Hello, everybody. My name is Joanna Chwastowska.
And my name is Bartek.
And we are both software engineers working for Spring, startup from New York, here in Krakow. And what we wanted to tell you about today is Flux, Immutable, and React.js, and how those technologies can be used to create delightful applications. Just to set expectations right, we were told this is a technical conference, so our talk is much more technical and much less high-level inspirational than the previous ones. We are sorry for that. We will improve for future. But for now, what this is all about. So neither React nor Immutable as a concept and the libraries aren't something new and like a breakthrough right now. They are on the market for quite a couple of years already. And what we wanted to do with this talk is to take a step back and try to figure out what we've learned by using them for almost 3 years right now, and what advices we can share with you about them. As probably some of you know, Flux is a powerful tool in itself, but as every tool, it can be misused. So we will also focus on a couple of traps we got into ourselves and how we got out of them. And what the UI simplification means in our presentation, it's not necessarily about writing less code or writing simpler code. What we think as a simple UI development is when it's much easier for the new people to join the team and be on board to your product, and for them to build the understanding of what is this thing you are building and how it really works. It's simplified when you have to debug something, you know how to do it, and it's easy to just find the holes in the application. And also, it should be easy to maintain. So as your application grows in time, it should be easy to grow it and to modify it and to allow it to evolve in a natural way. Today's presentation will be a case study. So we will share part of our code base with you. What we do, to give you a couple of words about, is we are writing global market store, a place where you can come and buy from over 1,200 brands, over 100,000 products at the moment. And as you can imagine, the UI requirements for that are pretty complex, not only because of the large amounts of data we are dealing with, but also because we are in a fashion. And that requires the UI to be pretty and delightful and sleek. So, you know, stretch on the engineering side and stretch on the design side. That's where we are trying to help. And with that, to Bartek.
Yeah. So let's start with Flux design pattern. This way? This way, yeah. Cool. So as Joanna said, it's nothing new, right? And you can find many implementations of Flux already out there alive. But the one that we use is very small. It's actually, how do I turn this on? How do I turn this on? How do I use it? Oh, here. Okay, so we are using the original, basic, bare-bones Flux dispatcher from Facebook, yes. And it's so small that it's less than 1% of our code base. So you can imagine that with such small amount of code, there's, well, nothing exciting to do, right? But indeed, it's a working horse of our entire website. So what we are going to focus today is not the implementation side, but rather the design pattern side of this beast, right? We are talking more about the design pattern than in implementation. So for those of you who know what Flux is, I'm terribly sorry I had to introduce the elephant in the room and show this diagram to everyone. Okay, so Flux design pattern is a pattern for creating rich web applications that is focused on lowering the maintenance cost. So your application is easier to understand, easier to debug, it's easier to figure out what's going on inside. And it's based on a central idea of single direction of the data flow. Let me show it how it works. Okay, so it all starts with actions. Action is an external stimulus to your system, right? So it can be a user clicking a button, like here on the top, or it can be a server returning some data to your application, like on the left, right? The important thing to remember is that action is a sort of a stimulus that pushes your system towards a state change. So it works like a huge state machine. And these actions are dispatched by the dispatcher, right? The dispatcher is a central hub that your stores listen to. Your stores subscribe to different actions. There's a many-to-many relationship between actions and stores, and they react to different actions, and they change their state. Important part about this is that you have to remember that this response from the store should be synchronous. There should be nothing asynchronous that your store is doing, and that's an important thing to remember. Right. So the stores are so we can have like many types of stores. You can have a user store, you can have a product store, you can have a cart store. Each of these stores hermetizes part of your domain model, and in particular, it hermetizes the mutability aspect of this. So what is nice, and what we are really glad about using, is that it allows us to create the view part basing on React with pure functional components. Now, a pure functional component means that it's a component that doesn't actually hold a state, okay? All right, that's the ideal world. We have a couple of components that are not necessarily Flux ready yet, but this is the ideal world. A pure functional component is something that takes your state as an input and produces an output that is UI. Nothing less, nothing more. And there's no fiddling with mutability, there's no fiddling with states, there's no way a component can change, because the only way it could change is by re-rendering itself from the very beginning. Performance-wise, there are some optimizations along, we're not going to touch on that, but trust me, it is fast enough to be usable. It is powerful. And then the loop goes on, right? We have an action, we have a dispatcher, store, view. Action, dispatcher, store, view. Everything comes into one direction, okay? So let's put this into perspective and see how it works under the hood for us. We have about 40 stores, 40 immutable model structure types. Joanna is going to tackle this topic a little bit later. About 170 actions, about 300 React UI components, all of this in desktop and mobile version. And I think we were developing this system for about 3 years now, am I right?
The whole system for 3 years, and the web part actually for like a year and a half.
Exactly. Okay. So now, let's move on to the interesting part, okay? The thing that we learned the hard way. We learned many things. We could talk about it, but we have a short time, so we have to focus on one single particular issue that I found very frustrating for me personally. So one misconception is that Flux is event-driven. It is not. Believe me, it is not. Even if it may seem so, it is not, because actions are not events. The word act basically means to do something, to take action. So it's not some random event that happened inside the bowels of your giant machine, right? It's an external stimulus. I like the word stimulus, by the way. It makes me sound wise.
We noticed.
Yeah. So it's something that pushes your system towards a state change, right? So let me illustrate with an example. Let's say we have a system in which we have some sort of user store. And this store responds to the received login response action that comes from the server, right? It's a server response. And obviously, we store the user data that came from the server, okay? So far, so good. So now let's, oh, by the way, this is a code inside a store. It means that we are reacting to this particular type of action. Okay, and now we are extending our system. We want to introduce a second type of user, right? And let's say we want to distinguish between guest and a regular user. Now, I'm very sorry for naming here user logged in. I don't know what I was thinking. It should be probably like real user logged in or something like that. So we want different stores to be able to listen to that action, right, and to respond accordingly. So what we do is just, okay, I'm not a guest, so I'm just going to dispatch an action called user logged in and hope that everything goes well. I should have put a cliffhanger here, but I was stupid, so I already told you by this slide that this is not going to happen, right? The Flux dispatcher is going to complain. It's going to say, cannot dispatch in the middle of a dispatch. It's going to say that you can't just dispatch an action while your stores are busy consuming another one, right? Okay. So when I saw this message for the first time, I said to myself, okay, why are these guys so perverse? Why I can't just use the system the way that I would like it to? And, you know, the thing is, I said to myself, okay, if you don't want to do what I want you to, God damn, I'm going to force you to that. So, yeah, you know the escape hatch, like the usual one. If you can't do it right now, you're going to do it later, and it works. Fantastic. I call it the ultimate Flux dispatcher hack because it's going to solve 90% of problems you're going to ever have with Flux. And at the same time, it's almost universally a bad solution. Why? Well, the thing is, the guys from the audience who know Angular probably have already seen this message at least once. It says, hey buddy, you're going to have a nice evening. There's an hour or two debugging in front of you. What happened here is it's permanently on? Okay. What happens here is that your model is unstable. And the sole fact of rendering it makes it change. So when you render it, it changes. So you render it, so it changes. So you render it, and so on, infinite loop, right? This is what it's all about. Now, this is also what Flux Dispatcher is trying to do to prevent us from falling into that trap. Because what we basically did is we introduced this alien arrow in the diagram from the store to action. And now observe one thing. When the control flows from an action to dispatcher to the store, and back to action to dispatcher to the store, and back to action to dispatcher to the store, there's no user intervention inside, right? There's no server. So you can fall into this very trap. You won't fall it by adding just one hack, but when you have like a couple of tens of them, you're almost bound to make it happen, right? And then you'll have a lot of fun untangling this thing. Okay, so how to do it right? Well, there are at least two solutions to this problem. There's this very standard, well-documented way. So in this different store, we can say, okay, first of all, we can obviously refrain from declaring this another type of action in the first place. Only rely on the received login response. And in another store, we can wait for this buddy and consume the results of its hard work. Obviously, this is a overly simplified example, but hey, it's going to fit in one slide, right? So please don't blame me. In this case, we could equally well just pull it directly from the payload of the action, but let's pretend that it's complex, okay? So this is one of the things that is different here. It's not an event-based model because when you're dispatching events, you're not able to tell some consumers to stop or to process this event because I want to have the results of your computations, right? You can't do it. And this is what you can do with Flux Dispatcher, and this is where Flux is fundamentally different from any other event-driven system. Okay, so this is one solution. But let's say that we don't have enough time to refactor our code, or there's no other way of doing it fast and elegant enough, or, you know, anything else from technical matters to manager tapping your back. Just finish it now. So let me propose you a different solution for this problem. Don't be afraid of action creators. Action creators are these tiny functions, like here, for example. We have this user logged in, right? This is an action creator. This is a function that creates an action, which is an object, and it dispatches it. So don't be afraid of using action creators for your purposes, because I'm sometimes seeing weird opposing among developers from doing this. They're kind of not used to do this. I'm not sure why. But hey, you can do that, right?
It's a lot of typing.
Yeah, it's a lot of typing. But hey, it's a very good point. If you don't use your action creators, they're nothing more but boilerplate, right? So use them. You can do it like this. We received some data from the server, so we're going to dispatch a received login response, then make a potentially extensive computation to perform some sort of decision, and then only dispatch exactly the action that actually happened, right? So sometimes we have to puzzle what's happened from the server side. One more potential circumstance where this could be also useful is when you have a chain of server calls. You could use promises here and just dispatch certain actions that correspond to certain stages in your server-side communication. Okay, having said that, let me clear the stage for Joanna.
Thank you.
Who's going to talk a little bit about our models.
Yeah, so Bartek already mentioned that Flux works very well, in our case, with immutability. And so what immutable actually means, it's just very simple concept that once you create a data, it cannot be modified. So whenever you try to change the structure, the new structure is being created that is, again, immutable. Why is it so important? We will see just in a second. But Immutable.js as a library is a very lightweight thing that when plugged into your application, it allows you to use those immutable data structures that you are all familiar with. So you will get the immutable version of map, an immutable version of list, set, and so on. It has a couple of nice additions, of course, but this we'll get to in a minute. The thing about Immutable.js is that it's a JavaScript-first API. So even though it was inspired by functional programming, it's actually an object-oriented API that mirrors the ECMAScript 6 API for the list, for the map, for a set. With the slight difference that whenever the regular version of the API would just modify the collection you are operating on, in here you will get a new instance of the immutable collection. And important thing about immutability is to think about objects as the values, because object is a thing that changes in time, whereas the value reflects the state of the thing at the given point in time. It just cannot change because it's this point in time. And it makes development easier simply because there are two hard things in web development. One is tracking mutations, so knowing that something changed, and the other is maintaining the state of the whole application. So we don't have the first problem at all because nothing can be changed, so there is no detecting mutations needed. And maintaining the state is also simple, because you can tell whether the state changed only by using equality. So if you have a different object, it is a different state, you re-render. It enables the single directional flow of data that Bartek already mentioned. That means, if something changed through the external stimulus, if something changes, the re-rendering cycle goes through your application only once. If something changes at the top level and has to be propagated into all the components on your page, this will happen once and you are done. You are set with the new environment, basically. This immutably concept is important because it helps with preventing the spooky action at distance. So those situations where you think you have some data, you might be displayed this data, but some other object, some other place in the application has the reference to your data and it modifies it underneath. And out of the sudden you had the data and now it's a different data. With Immutable, once you have a reference to something, you are certain that this thing will not change. So when Immutable.js can go wrong is, of course, when people misuse it. We had this situation in our code base. We are not proud of it, but it happened. So you have the call to the endpoint, you get the data back, and then you react to the whatever payload you got back from the server. So in one store, you will read the data and create the immutable object out of it. In the other store, you will do the same. You would expect that the message in both of the stores will be the same. What if some other store read the data first, mutated the payload data, and then you are between the calls in those two different stores, you are out of a sudden creating an immutable object out of the different versions of the same mutable data. To prevent that, the lesson learned is create immutable objects as soon as you can. So in here, as soon as you get the response from the server, you create the immutable object out of the payload, and then you can distribute this immutable object. Now, whatever the store does with the data it received, you are sure it doesn't affect the state of any other component in the system. Actually, to this one, I can add that it's not only about create the immutable object as soon as you get the data. Sometimes what can happen is you will not create the immutable object deeply. So I still remember us having the bug where I thought I've created the immutable object. I just created the immutable object at the very top level of the hierarchy of the object. And it didn't propagate, so somewhere deep in the object, the changes were happening, and you think it's immutable, you assume it's immutable, so debugging is hard. So creating the immutable data as soon as possible is an important lesson. The other thing is, what Immutable brings to you is awesome record type. So in general, inheritance is bad in JavaScript. Like, people try to avoid it at any cost almost, using composition. But where immutable record is different is that it allows you to create immutable data and reflect the real model for your application on one hand, but also build this set of methods that are specific to this domain element in your system that will behave and act specifically for that data structure. So to sum it all up, what we were trying to deliver through this presentation is that after developing for quite some time with React and Immutable, but also having both of us some experience with Angular in a previous life, we believe this stack is really worth recommending. It's worth recommending not only because it simplifies the development. It's also worth to mention that it's great when you are a small startup and you have to hack something fast. Also because of what Bartek showed at the very beginning. It's very lightweight. So it's easy to learn, but it's also easy to integrate into existing systems. And also, we probably heard about one social network that built a pretty large successful product based on those technologies. So it also scales up very, very well.
It's Facebook, yeah.
And as with everything, the devil is in detail. So when you are trying to adapt to this philosophy, try to understand it, not try to hack it and like work against it. Try to go with the flow. And yeah, good luck. Thank you.